Well, there's lots of evidence that people can hold false beliefs. Indeed, many of the beliefs that many people hold are false. And horoscopes are a good example of this kind of belief that's been investigated scientifically. So, I mean, many of my students actually who should know better, who understand, I hope, how to evaluate the evidence for a theory, certainly when they arrive at the university, they believe in horoscopes, they read their horoscopes. Some of them say it's just a bit of fun, but why should you read some random prediction which has no validity for a bit of fun? I mean, that doesn't seem a likely real reason for that behavior. I mean, the evidence for this is quite simple to describe. So there's a psychologist called Forer, F-O-R-E-R, who presented a simple horoscope description to people and asked them to say, how accurately does it describe you? It consists of a typical kind of horoscope prediction, and also a description of what the person was like, what kind of temperament they had, what things they found difficult, what things they found easy, and so on. It was written in a sort of mildly flattering kind of way, so it sort of was quite a sympathetic characterization. The average agreement with this description, when it was offered to people on a 1 to 5 scale, where 1 is not, this does not describe me, and 5 is this is a perfect description of me, was 4.26. And only after he'd done the study did he reveal that everybody got the same description. So everybody believed that this was a particularly good characterization of them. Okay, so it's a particularly good characterization of everyone, in which case it's not a particularly good characterization of anyone, by definition, in a sense. I think you can see the logic of it. So people can be beguiled. They can see matches between things that are in descriptions, and they don't think about, well, hang on, how precise a description is that? Like, for example, you say a sentence like, sometimes you find it difficult to make decisions quickly. So does everyone. A lot of people think that they're the only people that have this difficulty, but of course it's not the kind of thing that people sort of announce explicitly all the time, but everybody has those kind of experiences. So you can string a whole load of phrases like that together, and everybody falls for them, and everyone will believe that's them. And they'll also believe, well, it's not just anyone, it's me to a T. So, these sorts of false beliefs, there are many sorts of examples of false beliefs in psychology that have been studied. You can even see them in experts. I mean, this is one of the things I'm particularly interested in. So, I mean, something which is a million miles away from horoscopes, but a still rather startling example. If you look at sporting experts, there's a phenomenon called the hot hand belief in basketball. So all the players, coaches and fans all believe that when a player has scored with his last 2 or 3 scoring attempts, he's more likely to score next time. Why? Because he's hot. And if you look at the evidence statistically, he's actually less likely to score next time having scored. But everyone believes it's true. So in the evaluation of evidence for hypotheses and the way we think about what kind of thing would count as evidence for a hypothesis, people are really rather suspect devices. And of course, when you meet people and explain these sorts of things to them, they say, no, I don't believe that. That's not right. Which, of course, is exactly what the psychology would predict. That people indeed are not going to be persuaded by a lucid, rational analysis of why their reasoning is wrong. Yes, I mean, intelligent people are not immune to the belief in fallacies. This is not a question of intelligence in that sense. Of course, when it comes to people who need to make the right decision that affects, well, everybody if you're a politician, but especially themselves if they live in a democracy where they have to worry about being re-elected, they have a vested interest in making a good decision. I mean, yes, these things, I mean, the hot hand example I gave earlier, this is believed in by the top coaches. The top coaches in American basketball believe in this. And when they were presented the evidence to say that this just doesn't happen, they rejected this completely. They said, oh, what do you know about this? So it's quite clear, I think, that people's brains are not geared to evaluating evidence in a kind of mechanical, statistical, logical sort of way with respect to certain issues. And you can see, for example, is it a good time now to go to war? This is not a computable decision in the sort of computer science sense. You couldn't write a computer program that says, oh yes, now is the right time to go to war. There are many intangible issues which are impossible to evaluate in a completely mathematical, algebraic way. They're judgmental. And so you rely very much on intuition, which is not amenable to verification by any scientific means, ultimately. I mean, in some cases, you can evaluate what people are thinking, and when they say they're confident about something, there are little tricks that we use to evaluate this. For example, if I ask you to say, how confident are you that it will, say, rain tomorrow, or that you'll pass your exams, or that Manchester United will win their next football match, you think, well, I could say I'm very confident. I can say to you, how confident? 90%, 80%, 70%? And then even if you're wrong, you might think, well, it doesn't mean that I wasn't that confident. But if I ask you many questions like that, and then I say, well, you said you were 90% confident on, say, 20 occasions. Well, you should get 90% of those questions correct. And, we do studies where we measure these things. And what you can discover, it's very simple to do as an experiment, very easy exercise, that people are massively overconfident. So when people say they're 90% sure they're right, they've probably got a 60% sure of being right. And if you do the right experiment, you can measure these things. Now, of course, in any given single instance, it's not possible to evaluate a judgment of that kind. And most people view their lives, and particularly horoscopes, as a series of single things that may or may not work on that particular occasion. But they don't do an audit of the whole thing where they could look at every single judgment and then see whether it works. Horoscopes are, for many people, a relatively frivolous thing. I agree, there are probably some people who do consult astrologers to make what they think of as important decisions. I'm sure there are politicians who have done similar such things. I think Nancy Reagan, you won't remember, you're too young, but she definitely consulted astrologers when President Reagan was in office. I'm sure this kind of thing happens, but most people think of it as a relatively frivolous enterprise. And, there's much in life which is uncertain and not understood and not predictable. So it's quite consoling when you get an authority which says, this is going to happen. You will meet a tall, dark, handsome stranger this week. Now, when you think about these kinds of predictions, they're very rarely that precise, actually. But if they were, does that mean that 1/12 of the population will meet a tall, dark, handsome stranger? I don't think there are enough tall, dark, handsome strangers to go around. So they're palpably not tenable. But even without that kind of critique, what's curious about horoscopes, I think, is they don't announce the reasoning. Now, a real science, it doesn't just say what it says why it knows what it says. It tells you the theory underpinning it. Now, I've spoken many times to astrologers and said, well, what's the theory? How have you done this? And they become, often more baffling because they say, oh, no, there's a proper procedure. We have to do a chart for you. It's very complicated. I say, yes, but what exactly is it that enables you to predict how my life will go this way and other people's lives will go that way? And I've yet to hear an account of this, except in the vaguest terms of the movement of heavenly bodies. But how that should influence whether I meet a tall, dark, handsome stranger and you don't. There are some serious studies which have tried to investigate whether or not there's any truth in astrology. And it turns out that indeed the fire signs and the earth signs in the astrological spectrum do indeed correlate very, very weakly, but there is a very modest correlation with personality variables. So, for example, extroverts are more likely to be from the fire signs, and introverts are more likely to be from some of the other signs. I'm not clear on the detail. Now, is that because there really is something in astrology? Well, the thinking is, no, it's not that. And you may think, well, that's these scientists who don't want to believe, even when the evidence is in front of them. But the argument is that people who know what their personality is supposed to be like, having read about astrology, they interpret themselves as being like that and thereby report themselves as being like that. So if I was a fire sign, I'd say, oh, yes, I'm a bit of an extrovert, even because, of course, people's personalities are somewhat ambiguous. It's open to some kind of interpretation. At the extremes, not so. But remember, this is a very tiny correlation. Statistically, it's very, very small. Most people don't show any relation, but there's a tiny little association. Now, one corroboration of the idea that the observed correlation between horoscopes and personality is indeed due to self-attribution by people who know about this comes from an interesting study done on Americans. Their death certificates record what they die from. Now, Chinese astrology, the year is done differently, of course, as I'm sure you know. So it depends on which year you're born. But another thing which perhaps isn't so well known is that Chinese astrology also indicates what your medical strengths and weaknesses are. So if you're born in the year of the dog, then you want to be careful about this part of yourself. And, if it's the year of the horse, then it's another bit of yourself. And so some American psychologists got hold of the death certificates of American citizens, and they knew that some of them were Chinese Americans. Right? Now, the Chinese Americans were more likely to die, I think it was something like 2 years earlier than average, if they got an illness with a part of the body that was predicted by Chinese astrology. And the thinking is, well, they were so worried when they got some kind of lung disease, and indeed the lung is something which the year of the dog has to worry about, that they worried themselves to death early because of their knowledge of this. The same association was not present in non-Chinese Americans, who of course wouldn't know so much about Chinese astrology and therefore wouldn't be so concerned. So believing in astrology is not just, a bad thing because it doesn't actually predict the kind of things it claims to do. It can actually kill you. Well, it's psychosomatic. So, you're more likely to worry if you believe in Chinese astrology, and then suddenly you have an ailment in a part of your body which is a particularly allegedly weak part of the body for that year. Then you will think, that's exactly what the horoscope said, and now you think you're doomed. If it's in another part of the body, no problem, because you don't associate that with the Chinese astrology, and so you don't worry so much. But it can knock 2 years off your life if you get an ailment in a part of the body which is flagged up by the Chinese horoscope.